So I'm guessing Goodfellas is also really a fantasy for women just as much as it is for men.
I don't know. Well, but that's the question I would
Yeah.
have. I don't know if that's to what. I think there's this weird line between, is there some kind of element of allure to some extent, but I think whenever you have stories that are being told by men about men, and then you have women in those stories who are very attracted to
Yeah.
the men in that,
It's still very much
and they're
part of
like,
the
oh, they're
male
so
fantasy
powerful.
then. Yeah.
Right. My question is, how much of that is an accurate representation of why those women are drawn into those situations? Hello and welcome to Cinema of Meaning, the podcast from myself, Thomas Flight, and my fellow video essayist Tom Vanderlinden from the channel Like Stories of Old that seeks to explore the depths of what cinema has to offer. This episode is part 3 in our gangster series where we're exploring gangster cinema over the years. We're looking at a film from each decade, starting with The Godfather and working forward to the present. This week we're going to be talking about Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas, a favorite of mine. I think one of the classics in like contemporary gangster mafia film. And if you want to join in this discussion, talking about it with other listeners and with us, you can check out our Discord, which you can get access to through our Patreon. The link is in the show notes, so go check that out and join in the conversation. Also, if you're listening to this, there's an arc to these episodes. We'll be talking about sort of the broader arc of gangster films and how they're evolving and how they relate to each other. So if you want, you can go back and listen to the others before you listen to this, but that's also not necessary completely. If you only want to hear our discussion of Goodfellas, we won't spoil other movies without giving a warning first. So yeah, let's jump into it. This for me, Tom, was one of the ones that I was really excited about.
Mm-hmm.
If you say gangster movie, Goodfellas is maybe the first one I think of. In my mind, it's the gangster movie, in part because it was just the one that grabbed me when I was a teenager and kind of first watching these films. I remember back in the day, I don't remember what age I was, but I was 18. And you hear about The Godfather. It's legendary. I watched The Godfather. And at first with The Godfather, I was kind of like, oh, this is like the greatest film of all time. It's kind of slow. It's not that exciting, except, I've since come around. I've come to really love that film. But to the teenage me, The Godfather was not the exciting gangster sort of punch that I was hoping for. But Goodfellas was. I watched Goodfellas and I was like, now that is the gangster. That's the gangster movie I wanted. So that's kind of, over time, I think I've come to appreciate The Godfather much more, but I still really have a soft spot for Goodfellas. So I'm excited to talk about it, but I'm curious for you, what was your experience with this film?
Mm-hmm.
I think this was only the second time you've seen it. Is that right?
Yeah, I actually don't remember when I first saw it. I know that I'd seen it before, but I didn't grow up with it, so to say. I came across it later in life, when I was more deliberately exploring cinema, I think. But I did really like it. I'm not sure actually why I never revisited it. Maybe because I knew what it was and I liked it, and I figured no need to revisit it, at least not anytime soon, and then not anytime soon became 10 years or something. But yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think this isn't very much the defining gangster movie, at least of the 90s. We covered the 70s, right. The Godfather, 80s, Scarface, and now into the 90s, the choice for which movie to pick as the exemplary 90s gangster movie. I think the choice for both of us was pretty easy. I did, before watching Goodfellas again, I did also watch some other gangster movies from the 90s. I watched or rewatched Casino, also from Scorsese, which only confirmed just how much he put his own stamp on the genre, and which never really went away afterwards. But I also watched a movie I hadn't seen before, and that was A Bronx Tale, from actually directed by Robert De Niro and starring, I'm forgetting his name, but the it also has Robert De Niro in one of the main parts, but also another guy who actually wrote the play it was based on, which is based on his own life. It's which was also a very interesting movie to watch, especially in the context of 90s gangster cinema, because it was very much inspired by Scorsese. You know, it has the sort of the upbeat editing, high pacing, the needle drops with a lot of music. It had voiceovers, or I think this one actually had only one. No, yeah, Casino also had the multiple voiceovers that Goodfellas also has. This one had the one voiceover, which has since also become quite iconic, I think, for any gangster movie. You know, it wasn't there in The Godfather, it wasn't there in Scarface, so I think I'm not sure if Goodfellas was the one to really set the example, but at least I think it's the one that really popularized it and cemented it as an aspect of this genre, where you have this very heavy narration, which can be a bit silly at times. You know, it's not just a narration to convey information; it's also to give us an insight into the way these people see the world, the way they talk, the way they interact. Which is actually quite funny when you see it in a non-Scorsese movie, because that's, you know, sometimes it's easier to get a grasp on someone's style when you look at someone who's trying to imitate it.
Yeah.
Or not so much to imitate it, but at least someone who's clearly an admirer of it and inspired by it. And that's also what you see in A Bronx Tale. You know, that's done. It starts out with this young kid who gets caught up in the gangster life. And there's this introduction to all these eccentric gangster individuals, and it will be like, oh, you see that big fella over there? That's Fat Tony. You know why they call him Fat Tony? It's because he's fat. You know?
Yeah, yeah.
All that kind of narration, and but it's actually a very it starts out a little derivative, but it actually develops into I think quite a nice story that sits very nicely in the wider filmography of the gangster cinema. I try to get like a sense of like what else is out there in the 90s, but I feel like when you specifically look at gangster movies, there's just no going around Goodfellas. Like,
right, yeah.
Choice. I think the second choice would have probably been Casino, which was also Scorsese.
Yeah.
A Bronx Tale would probably have been my third, but which is heavily derivative of Scorsese.
Right.
So, yeah, it does feel like in the 90s all roads lead back to Goodfellas, and so it's clearly an inevitable point in like cinematic history here, where you end up, or you have to get past if you want to talk about gangster cinema through the decades.
Right.
And for a good reason. I really enjoyed this movie. As you said, I think it has a very there's a very distinct energy to it, which borrows some from, not so sure it borrows, but at least in our discussion, there's some translation there from Scarface, where it takes the high octane, unhinged 80s and sort of regrounds it a little bit more. Because that's the interesting thing too. We're moving forward the decades, but the story itself moves. We're moving back chronologically.
Yeah.
We went from The Godfather, which took place in the early 20th century, and then to Scarface, which at the time was a contemporary movie. And then now in the 90s, we're moving back again to another story that plays out over, I think, around the midpoint of the century.
Yeah, it runs from like the 50s into the 80s.
Yeah, that was kind of interesting. Scorsese has always been a filmmaker that has this strange balance between showing the life of sin and showing the life of the sacred, and kind of there's always some sort of biblical almost, or a religiosity to his storytelling, which I find very interesting, even when he's being blamed or criticized for glorifying all these gangster lifestyles, or the Wolf of Wall Street, or generally less inspirational figures. But I feel like especially if you look at those movies in the wider context of his work, you also have Last Temptation of Christ. There's Silence, Kundun, some others I'm probably forgetting.
The real, I think, touchstone there is Mean Streets, which we didn't talk about in the 70s, but that was Scorsese's first foray into gangster filmmaking, his first work with Harvey Keitel and Robert De Niro. And that's really kind of a predecessor to Goodfellas, like in a lot of ways. But in that movie, the sort of like spiritual allegory and connection, you can see it. There's a fusion there much more directly. And then it's still there, I think, in Goodfellas. Like there is a preoccupation a little bit with like redemption and religious themes to a degree, but it's definitely much more implicit. It's not, very explicitly explored in this story itself. But I think you're totally right that like if you look at this movie within Scorsese's larger implications, and then some of the films he's made since this movie as well, you can definitely kind of see his interests in these subjects, not just for the allure of this lifestyle or, the sort of, salacious element, but also because, there's kind of this question of like, can somebody this bad, is redemption still open to them? And that's a question I think, I don't want to jump too far into the movie itself yet, but I think that's a question we'll come back to.
Yeah, definitely. Linking back to the discussions we've already had in the previous episodes, we've been trying to discern some recurring tropes and commonalities between gangster movies and the question of what makes a gangster movie. What do you think after Godfather, after Scarface? What are the most important elements that Goodfellas brings with itself, and which things does it add, or what does it progress? Or
I was thinking about that as I was watching it this time, and there were a few things that stuck out to me. The first being, I think this is a movie that definitely exists within the context of viewers who are already familiar with the gangster film. So Goodfellas is a movie that comes into the genre with it as an established contemporary genre, which arguably Scarface, Godfather were already doing to some extent. As we discussed, there were gangster films as far back as, the 30s, but they disappeared for a little while during the Hays Code, and then they kind of came back in this new modern form. And I think Goodfellas is a movie that very consciously exists in that genre. And so a lot of the things we talked about in some of the other films where, it touches on sort of the familial aspect of at least the mafia, some of the social reasons why it exists because of police corruption or how it feeds into police corruption, all these things. Goodfellas kind of speed runs you just through that at the beginning. There's a big montage set up, and Henry Hill and his voiceover just kind of very explicitly lays it all out of the table.
Even like the opening line of the narration saying like, as far back as I can remember, I've always wanted to be a gangster. That already communicates not just, a lot of what this movie is about, but it also shows in sort of the underlying assumption that the public or the audience is already exactly familiar with what that means. People know what it means to be a gangster, and because they've all watched Scarface and Godfather, so we know we already have that sort of cultural association with it, and we know what kind of lifestyle he means by stating he wants the life of a gangster. So we already know to some extent what that means, and the movie indeed confirms that later on, as you said, when we show exactly the life that we assume is part of the life of the gangster, at least in the movies.
Yeah, so I think a lot of what the other movies, Scarface and The Godfather, are kind of exploring in subtext, where, in The Godfather we're seeing this gangster lifestyle, and it's kind of like up to us to understand why Michael Corleone gets drawn into that world. You know, we have to think like, oh, the sense of power over others through violence gives him a feeling of personal justification or something. I don't know, that we have to like connect those dots for ourselves and put it together, because there's no real explicit discussion of what is their motivations for getting involved in this lifestyle. Or we have to say like the familial structure, the sense of camaraderie, the way in which there's kind of this code that they follow and watch each other's backs, even as they are kind of at war with each other sometimes, that has its own appeal. Even though they're criminals, these are things we have to connect ourselves. In Goodfellas, Henry Hill's just saying that. He's like, he just comes out in the voiceover. He's like, it made me feel important. Everybody knew who I was. I got money. I got all this great stuff because of it. It was great. I didn't want to be a schmuck, basically, is what he says. I wanted to be somebody, and being a gangster in his neighborhood was the way that you became somebody. I think the way in which the movie kind of sets that up very deliberately and then takes you kind of inside that perspective a little bit is very interesting to me.
Yeah, no, definitely, I agree. The things that I wrote down after the last discussion were that the sort of traits for the gangster movie were the inherent tragedy in their storytelling, the sort of rise and fall, or you're selling your soul to the devil and waiting for the devil to collect. That all those kinds of story arcs tend to be present and here as well. You mentioned the use of violence and force, and especially also the use of sudden violence as not just as a way of providing action to a movie, but also to provide narrative twists with characters who are being unexpectedly whacked, as they say it in Goodfellas, and which is also again an element that comes back in this movie often. You already touched on the idea of brotherhood and there being a code, which I think, as you said, was made much more explicit in the 90s. The Bronx Tale also showed this very explicitly, where you have this young kid who is taken under the wing by this mafia boss, and he also explicitly tells him, you have to show these values. You have to be loyal, you have to be prudent, you have to be, but also intelligence is very much valued. And you see examples of the kind of guys who don't possess those virtues, and they don't make it up the ladder in this world. So it's interesting that there's always in these structures, as you mentioned, these familial structures of the gangster social system, there's this inherent heroic journey built within them almost, where there is a sort of path laid out that if you have the right virtues and you follow that path, then you get out on top. Even though ultimately they always have to crash down in the end.
Yeah.
One thing I also thought of, which I don't think we mentioned last time, is that a very typical element in gangster movies is a very long time span. So that the story usually takes place between, multiple years or even decades, which really emphasizes that starting low at the bottom, ending up on top, and then maybe ending up even later with tragic regret or in jail or whatever. Or just in the case of Goodfellas, jumping ahead to the end a little bit, just ending up as a regular smart.
Right.
So yeah, I agree that that's all very much carried along from the gangster movies that we've already talked about, the 70s, the 80s. That's all continued, I think, in the 90s, even made more explicit in some ways. How about differences? What do you think this movie does that, for example, Scarface and The Godfather did not?
Yeah.
Both stylistically as well as thematically.
There were a couple key differences here. I think one is that, at least in the movies we've talked about so far, this is the first one that really kind of follows the story of a lower level character the entire time. So in The Godfather, we start with the Don himself, and then we also watch his son become that. And then in Scarface, we start with an outsider who's a nobody and watch his rise to power and then fall. And in this, we watch Henry Hill, who, you know, is an outsider. He comes in, but he doesn't make it all, you know, all the way to the top. He's kind of at the fringes this entire time. And the guys who were the main characters in something like Scarface or The Godfather are sort of the ensemble characters at the sidelines. So you have the Don, Paulie, you know, the boss. He's or I don't know if he's not a Don, I don't think, but he's the kind of the local boss or whatever.
Yeah.
And, you know, he's a minor character. It doesn't delve into who he is much. He just sort of is this background presence, this kind of fatherly figure to Henry Hill.
Very calm, stoic.
Yes. And he seems to embody that like classic Godfather sort of vibe. He's the one who's telling Henry, like, don't get involved with the drugs. You know, you have that. And then you also have the characters De Niro and Pesci, played by De Niro and Pesci, in this as the more kind of sinister, lawless side of things that I think we saw in Scarface, where, you know, they'll kill anybody. They're just out ruthlessly to do whatever it takes to grab up as much territory as they can. They're completely unfeeling about it. They don't care. But they're also kind of, you know, they're at the sidelines. Instead, we have Henry Hill, and we stick with him. So I think that limiting of perspective changes the story a little bit.
Yeah.
And then spoilers, we're also following the story of somebody who is, you know, a quote unquote a rat. So, you know, I think there's this interesting dynamic in the film where some of the other gangster movies that we see, you're presented with kind of this like code of ethics. It's like, if you're a good gangster, you'll never rat on your friends. They even set this up in the beginning of this film. But in The Godfather or Scarface, we'd see people bend the rules a little bit, but we were mostly kind of stayed within that world of, oh, the characters we're watching, they're a bad guy in the real world, but in the world of the gangster, they're following the rules. They're a good gangster. Whereas in this movie, I think we see Henry Hill, he's a bad guy in the real world, but also by the end, he also breaks the gangster code. And that's what allows him to sort of go back and become a regular guy. So there's this weird like exploration of that relationship between the sort of gangster code of ethics and the fact that he is somebody who is not, he breaks those rules of the gangster world. And that's what allows him to sort of escape while all the other guys end up in jail. So I think that's kind of a big shift in how that sort of ethic and rules are presented in this movie.
Yeah. I also think this is the first explicitly true story, right? As far as I know, you know, Scarface and The Godfather are just based on fictional stories. I'm guessing they're obviously very much rooted in actual history, but...
Right, yes. Yeah, as far as I know, the book by Mario Puzo that The Godfather is based on is just a novel, right? Yeah, it's a fictional crime novel. So yeah, that's an interesting dynamic here as well. And I think one thing we're seeing in this movie that we're not seeing in Scarface or The Godfather is the police really starting to catch up to organized crime. So in both of the other movies, in the decades we've seen so far, the threat is mostly like other gangsters, kind of the interfamily war.
Yeah, and more the internal demons that start consuming the main characters from the inside. Yeah.
And that's definitely a thing here. The whackings in this, the sort of underlying threat and the paranoia that builds up about. There's kind of this interesting maneuver we get in this movie, where at the beginning Scorsese sets up this sense of camaraderie and family, and Henry Hill's like, hey, everybody knows everybody, it's great, we're all friends. And then that you start to, beneath the surface, especially Tommy's character, you start to feel this like simmering threat. And then as time goes on, that familial camaraderie devolves into utter paranoia, and you start to really get this sense that that's all just a facade, and really underneath that you could be killed at any moment by the people who are closest to you.
Yeah. It feels like that literal embodiment of, I don't remember the exact saying, but that idea that civilization is just like 2 meals away from total anarchy. And
yeah.
I feel like in this world, more than in the real one, there's, that explicit sense that there's, as you said, there's this facade of camaraderie and these very, everyone's shaking hands, giving each other little tips, and then getting a bottle of wine in return. And, but beneath all that, there's like, anybody is like one bad joke away from being whacked and
right.
or at least severely beaten up, as also is made somewhat explicit in that scene where Pesci's character is that Tommy in the movie?
Yeah, Tommy. Yeah,
Tommy. He is pretending to be offended by a joke that Henry makes, and then which is later on shown to be a very real sensitivity that he does have,
right.
And which leads to all kinds of violence, and which suddenly makes that world feel less appealing, and which, as you said, brings that paranoia into it in a very nice and convincing way, I think.
While we're on the subject of differences, one of the things we talked about in the last episode was sort of the women characters, the representation of women in these movies. And that was one thing I'd forgotten from this movie, was kind of, I think we do get Karen, Henry's wife, is a little more fleshed out in this movie. We get a little bit more of her perspective than I think we do in the other 2 movies we talked about, where, again, in terms of taking kind of the implicit motivations and making them more explicit, I think in this one, in the other movies with...
Yeah, the Tony Montana's woman.
Yeah, Tony Montana's wife. In that film, like, we're kind of left to guess at what her motivations are for attaching herself to these men that are violent, and, there's this kind of like false naivete where there's this plausible deniability, but they really know what's going on, kind of thing. That's all alluded to, but it's not really explored directly.
Yeah.
And I think in this movie, we get a much more direct exploration of those things. We get Karen's voiceover a little bit, and we get her kind of talking about, we get a revelation that she's implicit in this.
Yeah.
To some extent, she's a victim of his violence and abuse, but also she's implicit because she likes the power and the violence and the money as well.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a little more depth here, which I think is something that is interesting.
Yeah, it still feels like a bit of a stereotype, the women falling for the bad guys, which,
right.
I'm guessing there's some truth to that. I think there's a reason that movies like Twilight or books like Twilight, I guess the movies too, but and 50 Shades of Grey become so popular, especially among female audiences, because there is that, I guess, that bad guy fantasy there, which they enjoy to some extent. And I've talked to plenty of women in real life who have expressed the same thing. So I'm guessing Goodfellas is also really a fantasy for women just as much as it is for men.
I don't know. Well, but that's the question I would have. I don't know if that's to what... I think there's this weird line between, is there some kind of element of allure to some extent? But I think whenever you have stories that are being told by men about men, and then you have women in those stories who are very attracted to the men in that, it's
still very much
and
part
they're
of the
like, oh,
male
they're so
fantasy
powerful.
then. Yeah.
Right. My question is, how much of that is an accurate representation of why those women are drawn into those situations?
I think there's some overlap there, yeah.
Right. it's not something that can be easily sorted through, but I think it's worth noting that
I think generally men fantasize about being desired by women or being in a position of, or like a status position in which they are desired by women. So it makes sense then that there's some overlap between what women desire in their men and then the place that men also want to find themselves in.
Sure.
It's kind of like a minor issue. I think when you talk about this in the sense of stereotypes,
Right.
and I'm not really saying that as a criticism, I think, because I feel like women are also allowed their fantasies, I'm guessing, just as much as men. So it's not really an issue that I have with the movie. But yeah, I do think the question is interesting whether or not, where the male fantasy sort of ends and the female one begins, and to what extent they can coexist, or to what extent there are differences. That's also one thing that I was thinking of. I had a literal note written down that says, "Women like dangerous men?" question mark.
Yeah.
Because it's something that the movie does make explicit by giving us that direct insight into the female perspective, which I thought was nice, and to have those occasional glimpses into her narration or her inner monologue, which I'm not sure I've seen before that often. Casino has it also, but that's also by Scorsese. But those were, I think, mostly the two male leads' narratives. There's obviously like Terrence Malick or something who uses multiple voiceovers or multiple inner monologues in one movie, but that doesn't really, I don't think that really applies here when talking about the gangster cinema.
Yeah, there's that David O. Russell film, American Hustle, and he kind of does it in a way that feels like a direct rip of Goodfellas, basically, but it doesn't work as well for me.
Yeah.
Scorsese, and this movie in particular, Casino, probably you could also use an example, is one of those examples of like, voiceover is one of those things in film school. They'll be like, oh, voiceover is or like screenwriting classes or whatever, they'll often be like, don't use voiceover, it's a crutch or whatever. And this movie is one of the examples of like, yeah, you can break that rule as long as you just do it well. Like, the trick is just, it's not that voiceover itself is inherently bad. The trick is just doing it in a way that is compelling and adds to the story, rather than is a crutch that the story is resting on.
Yeah, because I definitely do believe, as I said earlier, that it doesn't just serve to give us exposition that we otherwise wouldn't get, but it also just gives a lot of flavor to this world and that sense of what it feels like to be in it. And I think also towards the end, when Henry becomes a little bit more like coked up and frantic and chaotic, then the narration, it feels, also changes, and the whole narrative structure starts to become more jumbled because it more directly reflects his internal experience of his own story. So in that sense, I think it's all very much interlinked. It's not, I think, a story that you can easily extract the narration out of and then see, like, for example, with a movie like Blade Runner, which originally had infamously a voiceover track, but, it could be taken out and the movie was even better for it. I don't think you can do that with Goodfellas. Which I think is a good sign that, it shows that the narration is just as much an integral part of the storytelling as much as the visual elements and the other audio parts. So yeah, I'm generally a fan of Scorsese's use of narration in this movies and this movie and many of his others.
I think one of the big things that's represented in that narration here is a kind of naivete where in each moment we're inside Henry's perspective and he's talking about how great these guys are, how trustworthy everything is, or the perspective that he's coming from in articulating this. You really understand why he as a young man wanted to be a gangster, or why he felt safe with these guys even though they would just kill, at least at first, even though they would just kill someone at the drop of a hat. He felt like he was safe and on the inside, or the the voiceover really helps bring you into that perspective. And it also creates this unfolding kind of cognitive dissonance in the film where sort of the reality you're seeing depicted eventually starts to kind of contradict the perspective he's been giving you to a certain degree. And I think that creates a really powerful effect. And then I love the twist at the end of kind of this little addition where you start out and you think, oh, I've just been hearing voiceover where he's telling us about how great this life is. And then at the end, there's kind of this tiny little implication of like, we've been hearing him on the witness stand sort of ratting on his friends the entire time. And yeah, there's that just kind of recontextualizes things in a way that I think is kind of a little bit fun.
Mm-hmm. I also wanted to ask you, this is a movie from the early 90s, but the 90s were also very much defined, I think, by this sort of detachment from normal society. There's movies like Fight Club, The Matrix, Office Space, all of which have this sort of disassociation from the smug life, the normal life that's also ridiculed by Henry Hill in Goodfellas, and that he tragically ends up becoming a part of. There's something ironic about this, the tragic fate at the end being that Henry Hill is now just a regular citizen like you and I are, like everyone else. I'm not sure if I have like a specific question here, but I did want to point out or wanted to address that idea that we've now also moved, 70s, 80s, and now in the 90s also moved in a different cultural space that may or not, I'm guessing that's my question, like to what extent do you think the cultural developments in the 90s and that sort of disconnect from or detachment from the regular life informs and places or like contextualizes this movie?
Right. I think kind of what we're seeing to some extent is the social environments that are creating the gangster, at least as represented by the movies we've mostly been talking about so far, are shifting a little bit, where primarily early on we see, there's police corruption that's creating problems in a community, and that community looks to organized crime to sort of solve those problems, and that's kind of what creates the gangster. And then again, in Scarface, you kind of have economic and political turmoil that creates this environment where you have the gangster sort of exploiting this
in the hyper capitalization of the American dream, and
all of these things. I think we're starting to see more of an extension of that, where as we go from the mid-century into the turn of the century, it starts to become more about the alienation of kind of this like modern life, the breakdown of further breakdown of various institutions that are there to provide people with structure and community and meaning and all of these things. And so for Henry Hill, the way he's describing it, he wants to be a gangster not because he doesn't see any kind of economic opportunity outside of that, not because there's this power vacuum created by
he's not an oppressed
corruption.
Citizen or anything like that.
He is sucked into it because the lifestyle itself is glorified, and he wants to become somebody, and he wants to be more than that average guy. I wrote down there's a line he says towards the end about, he was like, we were treated like movie stars with muscle or something. And it's that sort of appeal of, I want to be a star, I want to be a somebody. And I think you could spend hours kind of trying to dig to the root of what causes that in our society, but I think it's clearly like beyond just somebody becoming a gangster. It's clear that like desire for fame, for success, for whatever, especially in America as it it has continued to grow, now it presents in different ways. You know, you'll be like a YouTuber doing crypto scams or something instead of a gangster, but it's the same sort of fundamental drive of like, yeah, I don't want to be sitting in an office at a 9 to 5 job, just like, you know, being controlled by the petty whims of middle management, and I have no future besides a pension and, you know, a house that I can barely afford. The kind of breakdown of the American dream, I think, creates this environment where you get this really explosive reaction to that, where it's like, no, I still need the results of the American dream, even though the whole system that was supposed to give that to people is crumbling. So I'm going to do that at whatever cost is necessary, whether that means being a gangster or a crypto scammer or whatever. I don't know.
This might be foreshadowing a little bit towards the very final episodes, but I feel like the whole crypto scammer idea and the modern gangster is that there's going to be a shift. I think that Goodfellas is still ahead of, but you know, once we move into like the post-internet age, like the whole gangster story also becomes fundamentally different, because that's also one thing that I noticed again in this movie, is that it's very, just as the previous one, it's very localized, and the existence of the gangster network works because everything or everyone is in touch with each other. You know, there's this great airport heist that's pulled off. There's multiple ones actually. You know, they rip off the airport again and again, and it's specifically because, you know, they know everyone. You know, they know the baggage carriers. They know the folks cleaning there, or you know, whatever. They have all these inside connections, and, you know, these very real connections, a very like a physical network almost, that they can utilize to get all these little tips and to get all these little ins and angles to work these greater institutions. And I feel like that's, again, this is a little bit premature for the point in the discussion that we're at right now, but I feel like that's something that's going to be changing very drastically once we move into a place where our lives are taking place largely or less so on like in a physical space and more so on a digital realm that's just all over connected, and that has lost some of those roots with our more direct physical environment and the people that live there.
I think it's part of potentially the loss of power of organized crime, at least this kind that we see in these movies, comes from the diminishment of localization. Yeah. So it's easy to like gain control of a neighborhood when you can be in that neighborhood and know everybody and directly bribe them off and connect with them or exert, you know, physical power on them. But in today's world, the community is much more dispersed. Localization is much more dispersed. So yeah, I think that's definitely an influence.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I think when we're looking at these stories, it's almost less about the exact evolution of the gangsters in the world, and more so it feels like slight variations of the same story being told over and over again. But as we're progressing, there's little updates each decade, but as we're progressing, it's feeling more like the filmmakers' perspectives are shifting on this, because Godfather, all three movies we've talked about so far are happening kind of within the span of like 50 years of each other. There's not a lot of, it's not a huge span of time we're talking about here. Yeah. But just in the 3 decades from The Godfather to Goodfellas, it feels like the perspective of the individual filmmakers on these kinds of characters and this kind of story is shifting really quickly. And I wonder how much of that is a reflection of like changing sensibilities in media about the kind of media we want to create and the kind of media we want to consume. As much, you know, how much of it is a reflection of that as much as it is a reflection of changes in sort of the gangsters themselves and that kind of world. It's not either or probably, but I think those things are both at play.
Yeah, I think that kind of loops back to that what we were talking about, the shifting cultural context that these movies are made within, which kind of shifts around like the metaphors and maybe the direct appeal of these stories a little bit. I was thinking also with like, given how the 90s are more so about this disillusionment, I was also thinking back on what you said on this being a story that doesn't focus on like the top dog, but more of like the middle guy. But also how it shows that there is a very real trickle down effect in this world. Henry Hill, he's not on top, but in his private mind, he might as well have been. He's living the good life. He has the same privileges, it seems, as like the very big boss, but without having to carry those responsibilities, I guess. And in that sense, I think also what the gangster sort of social system in this movie represents, or in this context of the 90s, is that very real dream of having like a system of meaning, basically, some social structure that you can tap into and then become a part of it. And you don't necessarily have to make your way all the way to the top, but you at least you're engaged in some kind of collective meaning, and you get like a direct reward from it. It's you see it in Fight Club also a little bit, where they start the Fight Club and then the men, they become part of it, but they don't desire power or greed necessarily, or they don't want like Scarface. It very much was the sense that, you want the American dream, it means to be powerful, to be on top, and to be the most wealthy of all of them. And I feel like in movies like Goodfellas, or the general cinema in the 90s, it wasn't so much about being that, it wasn't being Tony Montana on top of this giant mountain mountain of money, but it was just about being part, or more, it was more about being part of this sort of brotherhood that gives you some kind of fulfillment that society at large is no longer providing. And yeah, I guess that's also what maybe is reflected by the way the filmmakers tell these stories, and the kind of cultural backgrounds there, or cultural sensibilities they're taking into it.
Yeah. Part of me wonders if this genre's success and influence in film is due to, maybe I already said this in one of the other episodes. Mm-hmm. I think maybe in The Godfather, I kind of talked about this a little bit, but I think about it again with this movie, where part of me wonders how much is the gangster film this kind of monolithic part of American cinema over the last 100 years, because it is in and of itself like a genre that captivates people, and how much of it is driven by the fact that you just have some of the best filmmakers specifically happen to be like Italian Americans. The sort of Sicilian mafia kind of like story was one that they were interested in telling, because it had intrigue, but also it was a way that, I think for Scorsese, he has this interest in the bad guys and kind of telling their stories, but you can see in his other films he also has an interest in just getting to show sort of Italian American culture to some extent. We see that in this movie with how lovingly he details the sauce and those kinds of details. That's something that goes all the way back to like a short film that he made called Italian American, where he filmed an interview with his own mother and father, and his mother is like cooking a sauce in the other room while they're doing the interview, and they're talking about Little Italy in New York, and his mom plays Tommy's mother in this movie as well, in the scene where they have the body in the trunk and they go in, they're looking for the shovel, they show up at 3 a.m. and it's one of the best scenes in the movie. And that scene famously, like, he didn't give his mother any lines. He just had the guys come in, they knew roughly the scene, and they just kind of improvised and ad-libbed all of that. And the person you see on screen is more or less like who Martin Scorsese's mother was. And she knew, you know, Joe Pesci and Bob De Niro. And so there's this familial camaraderie even amongst them that they're conveying on the screen. And so there's this interesting sort of anthropological element to these stories, specifically this one and The Godfather. And, you know, the fact that Francis Ford Coppola and Martin Scorsese just made like two incredible movies separately about this same subject that kind of build on each other makes me wonder, like, would this genre be considered like as influential as it was if it hadn't been for that? How much of it is kind of inherent to the thing itself, and how much of it is kind of, you know, Goodfellas is just a great movie in my opinion. That's really well crafted. I don't know. Again, that's one of those kind of impossible to answer questions, but I think it's an interesting.
How grateful do we have to be to the Italians for
how
Gangster
how grateful do we have to be to Martin Scorsese himself, who played, you know, a huge role in just kind of like creating. He's done much more than that. His cinema is much bigger than just the gangster mafia film, but he, you know, I think he's one of the greatest living American filmmakers. And if he hadn't been as interested in this subject as he had, you know, maybe we'd be talking about like movies about, you know, I don't know what else would have taken its place, but
something Italian, maybe chef movies would be the big
right,
genre.
Yeah, exactly. Cooking movies or something. Yeah. If some of the best American filmmakers had been French, we'd probably be talking about, you know, cooking movies or something like that. So
that does feel like a bit of an impossible question, but I do think there's a specific cultural iconography, I guess, to Italian culture and the way they are so often associated with like these big families that are all really tight and they're all really into food and preparing food. You know, it cinematically it translates very well to that kind of metaphor for that's family life, integrity, loyalty, attention to nice things, nice foods, and local foods, and local stuff. I'm not sure if the genre would not have existed without it, because you also find that in other cultures, but I guess it did help to sort of popularize it a little bit, and it's just a very easy translation, I think, from that specific element of culture to cinema. Because I know, like in Spain and Greece, they have comparable cultures, at least when it comes to, I think, to family and a love of food, and in France as well. Generally, like, Europe gets warmer socially as well as climate-wise when the further south you move, and the more northern you go, the more colder it gets. Again, that's as well as in temperature, as well as in the way social life works. Like, for example, here in the Netherlands, we do not at all have that kind of food culture that's in that you can find in the south of France or Italy or Spain. And people are still nice, but there's more of a cold friendliness, I guess, than really this warm embrace and these really tight connections, or in the way that you see them in movies like this. But I think the link between Italianism, Italian culture, and gangster cinema is also very interesting, because I feel like that's going to change a lot more in the next decade. So the next episode, in which I feel like there's a much stronger disconnect from anything that was so in the past, like a much cleaner break with like the traditionalism, which also includes like a break from the gangster cinema being just about the Italian mafia. I feel like there's going to be some very interesting movies that we're going to talk about. but they're also gonna. I think one thing that they have in common is that they all focus on different cultures and different ethnicities and countries and different, same gangster structure, but a different cultural flavoring, I guess. There's a word for that, but
I think it's worth noting that there's definitely a broader palette of gangster films than what we've been discussing. The fact that we have kind of focused primarily on the ones by Italian Americans is mostly due to those are the movies that have been the biggest and the most influential in America. There's traditions of gangster cinema in France, in I think Italy itself, and there's other ones in America that focus on maybe Chicago gangs or other. Their gangster cinema has been broader than just exploring the Italian American organized crime. But I think like the fact that three huge filmmakers, Francis Ford Coppola, Brian De Palma, and then Martin Scorsese, all very talented guys prior to even their work within the gangster genre, but all three happen to be Italian American, and all three kind of happen to explore this sort of landscape, and that happens to be, connected vaguely to their heritage. So I think, there's just an interesting kind of coincidental through line there that resulted in like the Italian mafia being kind of the most prominent figure sort of in this narrative arc of gangster cinema in the US. But that version of the mob really did break down kind of in the 2000s, and the thing that most clearly tells the story of that is The Sopranos. I think kind of in the trajectory that we're charting, as you just mentioned, we'll go on a little like detour, I think, next week. But in the 2000s, really it feels like, for me, I think the next piece in this puzzle would be The Sopranos, but we can't watch and talk about 6 seasons of a TV show here.
I've never seen it, so yeah. And
but that's definitely the next. In that show, those guys are watching Goodfellas, and that's one of their favorite movies. And we see sort of the further degradation of kind of the culture, the institution itself of the mafia kind of breaking down, and the figures who are being glorified in the to some extent in The Godfather, Scarface, and Goodfellas kind of becoming portrayed in a way that's even more like their coolness is stripped away to a certain extent, and they just are kind of this sadder version of themselves. So yeah, there's an interesting trajectory there that is much more than I think we could cover in one series.
Yeah. Also, we're called Cinema of Meaning, not Television of Meaning. But
yes, yeah.
But it's somewhat ironic then that there's the Italian American filmmakers who kicked off like the great gangster cinema, and then there's again the Italian focused story on television that kicked off what was arguably the golden age of television, I think.
Right, yeah.
It started off with The Sopranos, The Wire, which I both still haven't seen, but I did see Breaking Bad came shortly after that. Came all kinds of other great television shows. We've been mostly focusing on, as you said, like American gangster movie, but I do think to some extent that they are not just specifically a part of American culture, but I think also, as speaking as someone who is not American, and even in the Netherlands we have our own stories of like organized crime within our own country, but we still see like the Godfather, Scarface and Goodfellas as like the great gangster movies. So there's still I do think that even though they are American or specifically American, there's still something almost transcendental about them that I feel like carries them over into, at least in Europe. I can't speak for like I know India, for example, has their own history with, obviously they have their own like vast history of their own when it comes to cinema, but also specifically gangster cinema, and I'm sure other cultures around the world as well. But I feel like at least in the West, there's I think these movies have a specific kind of level of they're iconic movies for a reason, I think, and um, that's what I'm hoping to carry along as we move forward with this series, to kind of pick out these movies that are very much a specific product of a time and place, but also carry that greater transcendental quality that makes them relevant to or interesting and entertaining to everyone, or at least most people. So yeah, I think that's roughly it for Goodfellas, unless you have anything, any other notes.
No, I think we've covered it insofar as it relates to the broader discussion of gangster cinema. I have to hold back from not just gushing about all the filmmaking in Goodfellas that I love. I think I was watching this again and I was like, man, Thelma Shoemaker, the editor of this movie, longtime collaborator with Martin Scorsese, I think is just absolute master of her class. And in terms of editing, like, I think this is maybe one of the greatest, like, best edited movies of all time. There's just like not a freeze frame or slow motion shot or like dolly move or like needle drop that feels out of place in this movie. It's just like every time I watch it, it starts with such a bang, and then you get completely swept up and pulled into its current.
Yeah.
And I love the way this movie feels from beginning to end. I think it's
very retention friendly. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
It's like the Mr. Beast cinema, or the Mr. Beast version of.
No, don't you say that about Martin Scorsese. Don't you do him dirty like that.
It's not to bring him down. If anything, it's to compliment Mr. Beast and to kind of draw a line between what captivates an audience, because I do feel there's something electrifying about a Scorsese movie that also clearly like galvanizes a Mr. Beast video, and why his retention is in the 70%, while ours is around 30 or something.
Yeah,
getting into very analytical jargon here, maybe, but that no one but other YouTubers can relate to.
But I love the movie. I love the way it draws you in, and I love the way it kind of feels like you've been duped or tricked by the end, or it feels a little bit like that final look from Henry Hill. It's like, I kind of feel like he's pulled one over on us. Like when he's like, oh, I'm just a regular guy, like one of you. There's a disdain in that, but it's all, and he's portraying it as if he had this terrible fall into devastation, but ultimately there's a little bit of an indication towards kind of a failure on some of the broader justice system, or some of like the country. There's a little bit of a failure on a broader scale where he was involved in all this stuff, and the worst that happened to him is he ends up as a regular guy.
Even the time he did serve seems like a pretty fun vacation.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it ended a lot worse for some others, I guess. You get whacked or die in prison. But, and there's that question of like, is he actually redeeming himself to some extent by becoming a witness and kind of fulfilling more of like a duty to broader society by turning on these guys and then helping to put them in prison? I think there's a little bit of a question there that's interesting, but
I'm guessing there's also some note there on what it means to live a regular citizen life, that you have to sacrifice some highs, but you're also protecting yourselves from those extreme lows and extreme dangers that are very much present in this gangster life, and that you don't, I guess he has to worry about it because he's in the witness protection program, but for us regular citizens, that's getting whacked in the street is generally not something that we worry about. At least not, we don't worry about being specifically targeted for a whacking, which Henry Hill very much had to do, and he got something in return for that for a little while. But at the, in the end, he kind of finds that middle ground that we all live on, and to him that's hell. But I guess it's to some extent open-ended to how we feel about it. And after seeing his story, like it's like Scorsese asks, like, oh, maybe we can just be we can be satisfied with this, even if he is not.
Right. Yeah, it's just like he's living in a suburb, he's picking up a newspaper, and there's kind of this implication of, can you be if that's what you're given, is that enough? Will you be satisfied with that, or will you go off and pursue greatness or something more than that at all cost? Which I think goes back to what you were pointing to, as that ties into themes that are later very much playing out in the 90s with things like Fight Club and The Matrix, where it's playing on that same, like, the real world, quote unquote, the regular life is not enough. And so therefore out of that comes this desire for something else at all costs. Okay. Goodfellas, I could go on, but I think we have to wrap it up. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening to this episode. If you want to join in the discussion, again, you can find links to join our Patreon in the show notes below. We appreciate you listening, and we will catch you next week with the 2000s decade of gangster cinema. Talk to you then.